Hi, everyone. Let's talk a little bit about what is the argument of this course. Now, something I left out of my syllabus intro that I want to talk a little bit about. I'll share just a little bit of my background. My name is Aaron Ott, and some are tempted to call me Dr. Ott, and that's very flattering, but I don't yet have my doctorate. I don't have my doctorate just yet. I'm actually living right now in Orlando, Florida. I'm at the University of Central Florida working on my doctorate here. But why University of Houston continually has asked me to teach is because I have two master's degrees. One was from Dallas Theological Seminary, a Master of Theology, and the second was from University of Houston, right there in the Anthropology or Comparative Cultural Studies department, where I got my master's in anthropology. So with those together, I'm oftentimes able to take both the experience and data of my previous career as a minister and bring it into the area of anthropology, so you can look at things from a comparative cultural perspective. So myself, as I have my prior career long ago as a minister, and now as an academic anthropologist who is working on a doctorate in archaeology. These things bring me together, are brought together so we can have a good dialogue, a good experience, and be able to converse about all these ways in which religion and culture has to interact. Ours is a society that's not only has been growing secular for some time, but is increasingly secular, and for that very reason, dialogue and interaction with those with a religious background, well, two things. If you have a religious background, it's necessary for you to be able to speak human. Oftentimes, religious communities and religious, sects, S-E-C-T-S, oftentimes have their own internal dialogue, and they have their own way of talking and their own way of relating, and therefore it's difficult for them to kind of wander off the reservation and speak with other humans outside of the religious arena. So that's one thing we're trying to bridge. The other thing is that if you don't have a religious background, if you weren't raised in a church or mosque or synagogue, and for any reason don't have a religious bent yourself, that's fine. However, therefore, conversing with those who do can be a challenge for you as well. So what we're trying to do is, many people oftentimes talk about interfaith dialogue, where people of different faiths need to be able to dialogue and talk to one another more. Well, I think it's actually very positive, but there's more interfaith dialogues than occur simply between religions. There's also interfaith dialogue that occurs between people of a religious bent and people that don't have a religious bent. And Bible and Modern Science is a course in which those of a religious arena, the arena of faith, needs to constantly be in dialogue with people with the arena of science, and such that they can actually overlap. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the course, how they can overlap considerably and try to reject this against or head-butting conflict that occurs for some. So that's the argument of the course. The argument of the course is that a lot of these conflicts that occur between the Bible and modern science are artificial. Need not be so. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a great deal of the conflict, and again, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but a little bit later in the course, we'll talk about how a lot of the conflict that arises between the Bible and modern science comes from the interpretation of ancient literature. Ancient literature that is contained within the book that is oftentimes referred to as the Bible. Now, I have an entirely separate video on what is the Bible, but oftentimes, so I don't want to be redundant to that, but I will say this. The Bible is a collection of stories that people in the Judeo-Christian background place a great deal of trust in, as being stories that are authentic occurrences that occurred in the ancient world, and stories that either tell things that actually occurred or speak things that are actually true about the human condition, about the world, the cosmos, everything that we experience. So as a result, all of a great deal of faith is placed into how the Bible or the literature contained within the Bible describes how the world is and all that it makes up. Now, the challenge with that is that since the Bible is full of a series of ancient stories and many different books, it's difficult to interpret it correctly. And one of the ways in which we are often conditioned from the very beginning to interpret it wrong is this. It's one book. Now, this one's kind of fancy. It doesn't, and the reason why it's kind of fancy is because, quite frankly, oftentimes that's just, from a piety standpoint, people like to bind their sacred books differently than they do other books. So, for example, for someone who is going to use a Bible in a religious context, will want to have it bound, say, with leather binding and gold leaf and with extra special pages that are so thin that they rustle a little bit differently than your textbook does. If someone's trying to treat a sacred text with some sort of reverence, they want it to look and feel differently than, say, just any other book that a person might grab. Say something off my shelf. Oh, for example, maybe one of your textbooks by Lynn Mitchell. Paperback book, with pages that don't rustle and make a noise when you sift through them. I mean, even an image on the cover. Heck, that's not a way to treat a sacred book. So oftentimes people will treat a sacred book differently. And there's all sorts of ways in which they treat that book sacredly, such that they go, oh, that you don't treat this, you don't bind this book. The manufacturer shouldn't make that book look like every other book. Therefore, they don't want to treat it like literature the way they would otherwise. I mean, the book by Barber, I have no problem throwing that across the room. Now, I don't do that often because I don't want to knock anything off the shelf, and quite frankly, I have to go pick it up again. But I don't revere the Barber book. In fact, later on, if you're reading into the Barber book, you may want to throw it across the room too, as he gets really into the weeds on some of his scientific theories. But nevertheless, it's not a sacred text, right? So the Barber book, you pick that up and you go, okay, I'm so tired of reading this. It's so heavy for me. Toss, right? But people don't do that to their Bible. They don't toss it across the room because it's a sacred text. So somehow the way in which it's bound, the way it looks, that somehow it says something about them and their reverence by how they treat this book. And therefore, that conditions how they're going to read it. It's very difficult to read a sacred text objectively because you think to yourself, who am I to be deciding what, this is a sacred text. It's really kind of above my pay grade to decide whether or not it's coherent and written well, and whether or not all of its portions kind of go together. That creates weirdness in terms of interpreting a text also. The other thing that makes it weird is that the Bible is a collection of at least 66 different books. 66? Well, yeah, it can get up to actually 72 if you're in a more Roman Catholic section, because not everybody in the Christian community agrees how many books should be in this collection of books that we press and squeeze into a single book. Well, that doesn't make any sense. How do you have between 66 and 72 separate books and compress them, squeeze them into a single book? Well, we do that. That's it. That's what the Bible is. In fact, the word Bible is just nowhere even in the text. It's a word that's imposed upon it by Judeo-Christian history. Christian history, the biblos just means ruler or collection of books, or the books, biblos, from the Greek biblos mean books. So the Bible is just often the idea of the books, a collection of books. And so there's all sorts of different books that have some coherence to them. They actually do fit together in a literary and thematic sort of way, but they're diverse enough because of different authors at different time periods that oftentimes people make the mistake of treating one of those books, however thin a section it may be in the whole collection, treating that one book as though it's to be interpreted and treated the same as another. So, for example, let me grab the Bible again. The Bible. Let me grab it again and talk about, let's say, one of the biggest sections and one of the biggest problems that we will face in our class is how the book of Genesis is interpreted. Well, the book of Genesis is at the front of most Bibles, and it contains approximately this much. It contains approximately this much of the entire book. So therefore, some will say, well, wait a second, how you treat this book, how you read this text, well, if you must take that in factually, you must treat everything within that book as though it is written like a modern reporter would try to get the facts straight. You must do that. Otherwise, you therefore don't believe what this portion has to say about facts and figures and historic events. Well, that's something that's kind of a simplistic approach to a very complex body of literature that doesn't help the conversation about how you treat a sacred text. You treat a sacred text how it presents itself, and how you arrive at or how you approach that text. If you want to have a reverent approach to it, you approach that text the way it is. It presents itself to you. So if you're thinking of the text as being kind of almost an entity in and of itself, you would say of the text, how do you want me to read you? The Quran certainly does this. Hebrew Bible certainly does this, and certainly the the New Testament or the Christian texts of the New Testament certainly present themselves this way in terms of their own diversity. So therefore, it behooves one who wants to approach an ancient text, how would it have been received at the time? How does this text expecting me to read it, really? Is the text, if it's just a grocery list of various different facts, it therefore is not expecting me to read it as poetry. And we all can tell the difference between poetry and a grocery list of facts. If it's a long narrative, then it's not expecting me to treat it as a cut up, set of affirmations. So there's affirmational assertions that can be made. There's a narrative that's often can be made. There's poetry that exists. There's apocalyptic literature in terms of kind of a narrative hyperbole. Oh my gosh, the world is coming to an end. That's apocalyptic hyperbole. We use that in conversation all the time. The ancient world did the same thing with whole literary genres. So there's ways in which each of these texts, each of these books within this one compressed book, tends to present itself in a way that we should approach, that we should look at, that we should accept it, or at least interpret it the way it presents itself, the way we would any ancient text, whether the ancient Egyptian pyramid text, whether it's the Amarna letters, whether it's or anything from Mesopotamia or ancient Rome. Treat those things the way they're presented to you and don't impose upon it modern sensibilities. That's one of the ways in which we should approach a respectful way of approaching an ancient text. Now, one of the key ways in which a conflict between the Bible and modern science occurs is through this interpretation of an ancient text called the Bible. So, if that's the case, this conflict is occurring because of an interpretation of an ancient text, and then we should be looking at the way in which people interpret this ancient text. We should be examining that. We should be looking closely at the way in which people who maintain this conflict between the Bible and modern science, how do they approach an ancient text? How are they looking at it? And do we agree with the way they approach it? Is there a way of approaching the ancient text or interpreting the Bible, or at least the relevant portions of the Bible related to the conflict? Is their way of approaching those portions of the Bible valid? Are there other ways of approaching it? Are we even aware of the other ways of approaching it? Have we examined them? Have we looked at them carefully and thoughtfully considered alternatives? We want to look at that, because the argument of this course is, once you do that, once you examine and look at the ways in which people have looked at ancient texts, the ancient portions of the Bible, when you examine those and look at that literature, and you examine the motives of people that are actually maintaining the conflict, wondering who benefits from the conflict. Is there something, do they have an agenda in keeping the conflict going? Is this conflict really necessary? And is it being artificially perpetuated by those who somehow need that rift between faith and science Do they need it to keep going? Well, what if I don't need it to keep going? What if I don't see the conflict between the Bible and science, faith and science, that they say? They might lose some power out of that. They might be declawed, and they may be disempowered in their in some of their zeal to keep things separate. Well, we can't have that. Well, the goal of this course, the argument of this course, is to hopefully by the end of this course, you will see that those conflicts aren't as necessary as people say. And perhaps you will be, like me, one of those voices that tries to dispel the conflict and say, no. Science does not have anything to fear from faith. And faith has nothing to fear of science. And these two can not just dialogue, but sometimes even considerably overlap as well. So it's not that I'm trying to make you like me, but one of the reasons why I continually asked to teach this course is because the goal, and the department considers this to be a worthy goal, that we have more people that are able to dispel the conflicts and see where faith and science can be friends, come together, can dialogue. Because after all, there's so many people of faith within the world that we don't really do well to alienate people and discount their faith. And faith does not do itself any favors by alienating itself from science. Everybody benefits when you have better dialogue and you're able to have this. When I say interfaith in quotes, interfaith dialogue, it's because more dialogue is necessary not just between faiths, but between faith and non-faith, between faith and science, and considering the ways in which the conflict doesn't need to perpetuate, doesn't need to keep going, because it's usually that conflict is based upon methods and ways of looking at ancient literature and ways of approaching the world and faith at all that many of us, me included, wouldn't agree with. So maybe we can be the bridge builders. Maybe we can be those that are kind of building bridges across the chasm and seeing people of faith and people of science, and those pursuing faith and those pursuing science can sometimes be the same person. That's my 2 cents, and that's basically the argument of the course, and you'll hear that come up regularly as we proceed. If you have any questions, remember, use Blackboard messaging, and I'll be able to interact with you and answer your questions there, but also watch Blackboard messaging for new announcements that I make. All right? Have a good night.